Hey nerds, what's up? Today I'm going to talk about what I liked and didn't like about the First Law trilogy and my experience with grimdark as a whole. See you after the jump. So I did it! I survived my first experience with grimdark, and I'm excited to talk about it today. But I want to start off first with just asking the question, was the First Law trilogy overhyped to me? And the reason I want to start with that question is because this series was very hyped. Everywhere on Reddit, people are always talking about it. It's Reddit's little darling about how amazing it is. And in all the discords I'm a part of, everyone's always talking about this book. So I went in with pretty high expectations because people obsess over his character work and his prose and all of these things. So, did I think that the First Law trilogy was overrated? I'm happy to say that no, I did not think it was overrated. I thought it was so good. And I completely understand why everyone's so obsessed with this. And I agree with most everyone's praise when they talk about this trilogy. And I gave the first two books in the trilogy a 4 and this third book in the trilogy a 4.5. So this is like definitely a very solid 4-star series to me. And I'm so glad I read it. I think it's super good and not overhyped at all. So today I'm gonna go over what I did like about this series, what I didn't like about this series, and then at the end talk about my experience with grimdark as a whole. And that will hopefully help some of you who were like me, very wary to start grimdark, decide if you wanna try out Abercrombie's First Law trilogy or not. So let's get into it. Let's start off with what I did like about this trilogy. So first off, character voice. I already talked a lot about this in my review of The Blade itself, so I won't go into it here, but yes, character voice continued to be very excellent through the entire trilogy, and I think that's something that Abercrombie does particularly well, giving his characters unique voices. I won't go into it. You can watch my first video if you want to see my detailed explanation of that, but yes, this was excellent. The next thing I want to talk about is his characters and his character arcs. I think he did these very well, although contrary to what I see a lot on Reddit, I do think that he used quite a bit of character tropes. Like, there were recognizable tropes in all of his characters. I think that he was just able to twist them enough to make them interesting, and I also think it has to do with his excellence in character voice. Because he was so good at writing dialogue and writing these characters to make them feel like full people, it made the tropes come alive in a different way that I haven't seen before, so I think that's tied together. And now I also don't know if this is just because it's grimdark, but I did feel like the tropes got turned on their heads because normally these tropes lead to a certain thing, a certain development when we're having a happy story. But because grimdark is allowed to be so dark and depressing and characters don't get the endings we normally expect, that turned the tropes on their head. And I think Abercrombie did a great job of that. Now, I don't know if that's a very normal thing to do a good job of in grimdark, but he did it well here, and so I'm going to give him credit for it. Now, this is the section where I do want to talk about individual characters just a little bit, which will be spoilers. So I've put timestamps in the description box below. If you haven't read the First Law, but you want to hear more about why it's good and bad to see if you want to read it, just skip to the next section because I'm going to talk in this little character section with spoilers. So you've been warned, just jump a couple minutes ahead so that you don't get spoiled. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about individual characters. There's no one good in this book, right? There's no one that you're like, they're just the best. But there are 3 characters I wanted to protect with my life. The first being Yulwei. I'm just convinced he's the only good character in this entire novel. I guess we didn't see him die. I assumed he was dead, but my dad always taught me if you don't see someone die on screen, they're not dead. So maybe he's gonna come back in other books that are written in this thing, but as it stands, I feel like what I know about Yulwei is he seemed like a good dude and the only one in the entire book. So I want to protect him. Number 2, Dogman. I want to protect him with my life. I know he's not a good dude. I know he's killed and murdered a bunch of people, but I don't know. I just was so endeared to him. I felt like he was actually trying to be a good person and at the end was still trying to be a good person, which cannot really be said for a lot of the characters. And then number 3, West. Again, I know West isn't a good person. At the beginning, I remember in the first book, I was like, West is the only good person in this novel. And then he beats his sister, and it's like, oh, okay, guess not. But despite his flaws, which were many, I understand like domestic abuse is not funny or a joke, I couldn't help rooting for him a lot. Like, I was so excited when Jezal gave him the High Marshal position and when he was successful. And to be honest, guys, when he killed the prince, not a tear was shed. I was like, finally. It's not bad. I feel like reading grimdark gave me the ability to like root for deaths because I hated him, and I did not blame West at all. So those are definitely my three, like, must protect at all costs. But I did love all the other characters as well. One thing I want to talk about is Logan. I found the literary character arc of Logan very interesting and depressing, but I really loved how Abercrombie opened with a scene with Logan and then ended with a scene that paralleled it to show Logan tried to come so far and ended up right back where he started. The literary nature of that character arc I found very satisfying. I mean, depressing, but I thought it was a cool arc, and so I wanted to give Abercrombie credit for that. I loved that. The other character I want to talk about is Bayaz. Freaking Bayaz. I love Bayaz. Well, I mean, I hate him. He's a terrible person. He's straight up evil, but I love how his character was written in particular. I am a huge sucker for the old, wise, magical mentor trope. Like, I love it. Give me a Dumbledore, give me a Gandalf. They're in every novel, and I always am a sucker for it. I always love it. So when Bayaz first gets introduced, I was like, oh, this is going to be my favorite character. I already love him. He's such a good dude. And then as it going on, you're like, okay, so he has some anger issues, and he's thinking of breaking the first law, but breaking the first law isn't as bad as breaking the second law. He's just trying to help restore order to the world. And then by the end of the novel, you're like, oh, you're straight up evil. Okay, you're the worst person in this entire novel. Like, you have been orchestrating everything. You were power hungry. You are a terrible person. Like, when I found out that Sulfur was his own personal eater, I was floored. Like, literary wise, I loved that revelation. Like, oh, he's been on this high horse this whole time and really has been doing everything wrong that he's been saying other people shouldn't do. Like, oh, I just loved how I went from liking him to realizing that he was the worst person in the entire novel. I just love that arc. I think Abercrombie did it extremely well. Another thing that Abercrombie did extremely well is making unlikable characters likable. Now, I know this is a hallmark of grimdark, but I think that Abercrombie did a good job of not making it burdensome to read from his unlikable characters' perspectives. I did a review on the book Rosewater a while ago, and my main critique of that book was like, I liked the magic system, I liked what was going on in the book, but the main character was so unlikable, I literally had to stop the series. Like, I read the first book and couldn't go on because it was so frustrating and annoying to read from this flawed character's perspective. And Abercrombie does such a good job of having you root for his characters that are bad and writing them in such a way that you can handle reading from their perspective. I think the best example of this is Jezal. Like, Jezal was very similar to the Rosewater character in like their sexism and their vainness and things like that. But Jezal was like awesome to read from. I loved Jezal's story arc. I loved reading from him, even though he's such a vain, annoying, sexist dude. But it's okay because Abercrombie is skilled enough to write it in a way that you still want to read from it. I honestly don't know how he did it. I'm curious myself about it, but however he did it, he did a good job. The next thing on my list is sexism. Okay, I know that's like a weird word to put on a list of things I liked, but let me explain. So I think ever since I did the Witcher review, I've just been a little bit heightened sensitivity to these kind of objectification things, particularly when it came to reading Abercrombie, because my biggest fear about reading grimdark was what I had heard being a big topic in the subgenre, which is violent and graphic sexual assault, and using sexual assault as kind of a world building tool and just kind of a throwaway thing, and using violence against women as a backdrop. And that was what I was most nervous about going into Abercrombie. So the fact that I never felt that way once while reading this book was just such a great thing to me. Like, in the first book, I thought we just kind of got lucky. I was like, okay, there was like no objectification, and the sexism was clearly a character choice, and he didn't write his women sexistly, and there's no, sexual violence. But then as the trilogy continued, it became clear to me that Abercrombie was extremely intentional, and I can't explain how much I appreciate his intent with that, to specifically not be objectifying, to specifically not write women in a sexist way. Like, he did just an amazing job. All of the sex scenes he wrote that were graphic were consensual sex scenes. Anytime sexual assault was brought up, it was never, ever graphic. And the restraint he showed in that, I appreciated it. I appreciated also that the 4 instances I can think of where sexual assault was mentioned or a part of the plot was actually a part of the plot and not just a backdrop to be like, look how terrible our world is. Like, it moved the plot forward in some way in one particular case, very extremely moving the plot forward. For people who watched that Witcher video and thought, well, you just don't like mature stuff, like you just don't understand the difference between sexism and mature scenes, this is the trilogy you need to read to see the difference, because he does it wonderfully here. He does it intentionally here. Like, he knows how to write mature scenes, to write a sexist character, to write sexual assault in a way that is not graphic, in a way that is not putting undue victimization on women or undue violence to women and writing it off as no big deal, as just a part of a world. I just have to give him so much credit for that. And I just wonder if other grimdark authors are as intentional as him. And I hope to see it continue in his other novels in this world. And I hope this wasn't just a fluke. But as it stands, I'm really impressed with it. The next thing I liked was prose. He writes great prose. I don't really have much to say about it. I actually didn't notice it as much in the first one. I don't know. You guys let me know. Was this his first trilogy? Because I feel like his writing really improved as it went on. Like, it got better and better. And by the time I was in the third book, I was actively noticing the good prose. So yeah, I thought it was written very, very well. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is that he was able to make a depressing ending still satisfactory. That, I think, was the thing I was the most nervous about as I neared the end of the third book, was how is he going to wrap this up in a satisfying way when I know everything's going to be depressing? And I personally felt like it was a very satisfying ending in terms of, like, I had closure. I felt like the book was over. And I think that's a skill. I'm sure, again, that's probably a hallmark of grimdark, but since I haven't read anything else, I really liked how Abercrombie handled it. So overall, the third book was my favorite, followed by the first, and then the second in last place. Although I do want to talk a little bit about the second. The second was my least favorite book initially because it had so many fight scenes, which I'm going to talk about later. It just felt like every scene was a fight scene, and those are kind of my least favorite to read, so that dragged a bit. But I did really like the overall story in 2. But after I finished 3, it made me appreciate 2 more, because I didn't realize it at the time, but 2 is like the character's happy time, which didn't seem like it at the time. But I actually liked, by the time I got to the third book, how characters are reminiscing at that time, and it made me understand the second book's importance in the trilogy. So this definitely isn't a case where, like, oh, the second's the worst one, like I talked about in my trilogies video. It just was my least favorite for, like, the battle scene issue, but I do think it was a very good installment in the overall story. So it definitely wasn't weakened that way, especially once you finish the third book. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some stuff I'm neutral on, which might be weird, but it's going to be criticism I've seen about the book that I don't necessarily agree with, and I'm just kind of like neutral on. The first being pacing. I think that's the thing I hear the most complaints about, is just that the book really isn't 3 separate books. It is one book split into 3, a la Lord of the Rings. It definitely is kind of one big overarching story, one big journey. And because of that, the pacing's very different. Like, each book doesn't necessarily have its own contained storyline. The second one, I think, has it the most, but mostly it's kind of one continuous story. I can see how that would bug people. It personally didn't bother me at all. I actually kind of liked the change of pace. Like, it was interesting to read something like that because it doesn't happen very often in trilogies. So I personally enjoyed it. It didn't bother me, but I do think it's a valid criticism because it is true. Like, it definitely is true that there is not as much, like, subplotting like a normal trilogy would have. It's mostly just our full overarching story. So that was fine for me, but it is a valid criticism. The other thing that I haven't seen too much, but I just like to mention is, yeah, it's a mostly male-dominated perspective story. We really only have Pharaoh as our female character viewpoint. We have RD, but I don't think she ever gets a viewpoint. I really liked her. So yeah, I just like to mention that. It didn't bother me. I'm the kind of person who would rather have less good female characters than a lot of bad female characters. It's the same kind of criticism the first Mistborn gets a lot, or I guess the first era of Mistborn, where Vin is really only our main female character. I think it's like a valid criticism. It just didn't really bother me. I thought the story was very good, and I do know his best served cold is from a female perspective, so maybe that was like in response to that. Just something I like to mention. Just didn't really bother me. I enjoyed this book, and I wasn't really thinking about it until it was over. Okay, finally to the things I didn't like, and the cool thing about this is that they're mostly just personal preferences. Like, that I think attests to what a good book it was. The main thing I didn't like was just all of the fighting, the violence, the gore. I am a super baby when it comes to violence. I barely watch anything on TV and movies. Like, I cannot handle it. In the book, it's easier because I can just kind of like skim it. Like, anytime Glokta is chopping off fingers, I'm skimming. Like, I just can't, I can't read that. So a lot of the torture and the war scenes, like I just skimmed if it got really brutal because I just can't handle reading that. It's a little better because I'm not a person who has like a running image in my head, which is why I can stand to read this. Like if there was ever a movie adaptation of it, I can guarantee you I would not be able to watch it without some serious editing. Like with my husband in the room who gets to tell me like, okay, close your eyes. Okay, it's over, open them. So I didn't like that. I just also find fight scenes just personally very boring. They're usually my least favorite part. The reason I'm not criticizing it too much is I could tell that they were very well written fight scenes. Like I can tell they were well written. I just get personally bored. Like there was some, I think in the third book, there was a fight scene that was like 8 pages long, and that is just a lot for me. So that was like the only thing. I would love it if Abercrombie would write some like political grimdark where it's just like Glokta and Jezzel type characters. That I would love. I doubt he'll do it because he seems to be very good at writing war and I think he enjoys it, but let me know if any of his books are more like politically based because I think I would enjoy that a lot more if there's a little less gore and violence, but I feel like that's kind of like a hallmark of grimdark, so but yeah. My second and last criticism is just that I wanted more of the magic. Like, it was a really cool soft magic system. I loved the idea of like the magic is leaving the world. I liked these little pieces like the Eater, the first and second law. I really loved that. Like for some reason that really struck with me like, oh, that was really cool. The Eaters, the spirits that talk to Logan, like why? I know the point of this was not to delve into that, but I wanted a little more because I thought it was very interesting. So I wish some of our fight scenes could have been replaced with like maybe some more historical context about the magic system or just more info about that. I'm wondering if some of that is in the other books in this world, because I know he's written a lot of other stuff in this world, but yeah, I wish I could have had a little bit more magic. Okay, moving on. Did I like grimdark? No, I don't think it's for me. I loved this trilogy. Like clearly all the good things I said about it, I gave it a very high rating, but it just bummed me out, guys. I got to the end, I finished the book and I was like, well, that was depressing. Yeah, I just think I like slightly happier. I'm not someone who needs like a happy-go-lucky ending, but it was a downer. You know, it reminded me a lot of my experience watching Breaking Bad. I never wanted to watch Breaking Bad. My husband kind of tricked me into it. That's a whole nother thing. And I ended up watching it because, of course, I couldn't tear my eyes away. And I watched all 5 seasons. And at the end, I was like, that was objectively an excellent show. I enjoyed every second of it. And I never want to watch something like it again because it bummed me out. It made me feel dark and sad inside. And I just don't like feeling that way. So probably won't be reading a lot of grimdark. I am probably going to read Best Served Cold just because so many people have told me about it and I'm interested in it, but I'm going to take a long break. I need a palate cleanser, a mental sorbet, if you will, to get my spirits back up before delving in, because everyone's like, Best Served Cold is even more brutal and depressing. And I'm like, cool. But yeah, I think if I read any more grimdark, it would be under very specific recommendations from people who could tell me, you know, some of the things that are in it. Most particularly, I feel like it was pretty lucky that Abercrombie did not go into very graphic sexual violence, and I'm so convinced that that's kind of like a hallmark of grimdark. So I'd be interested. You guys can give me recommendations below if you feel like there's some grimdark that avoids that as well. But in general, yeah, it's probably not a subgenre that's just really made for me, but I definitely don't regret reading it because I clearly really enjoyed it. It's objectively very well written, and I really have a lot of respect for Joe Abercrombie. It's just like not necessarily a cup of tea that I'm going to be using all the time. So if you, like me, are worried about trying grimdark for the first time because of some of the things you've heard, I'm just going to go on a list of things you can expect in this book. Some of those more brutal things that you probably would want to know before getting into this. The first is that torture as a theme is very strong in this. There is a lot of torture scene. Additionally, a lot of war, a lot of graphic violence. There is a lot of violence in this book. Now, for me, it was easy to kind of skim over those parts because the individual violent parts tended to not be super important to the plot in terms of like, as long as I knew who was fighting who, I could skip the grisly details. So that worked for me, but it's just a warning, it's definitely there. There are sex scenes, but they are all consensual sex scenes. In terms of like the more graphic descriptive parts are all consensual. It is in there, but that's an important note to make. There are 4 instances where sexual assault is mentioned, but it is not graphic. It is mentioned as a part of a character's backstory when she's talking kind of about why she is who she is. It is interrupted. So nothing graphic is shown, but it is interrupted as about to happen. There is a scene at the end, I don't want to give anything away, in the 3rd book where sexual assault is implied to have happened. It does fade to dark. but it is coerced. The character doesn't know that the other character is being coerced into it, so it's a little different. But I would still consider it to be assault, and so just to know that is probably the biggest scene. And then someone mentions it in passing as like a man joking about it. But it is all like fade to black. But I think it's important that I lay those out because I feel like that's probably the thing that stops people the most from going into grimdark. I know that was stopping me the most, but it did feel not graphic and it felt pretty mild. So I just want to be specific about that. And finally, there is talk and some display of domestic abuse. I am glad I read it still. So if you're trying to decide like if you want to read a grimdark, I could still recommend this. I really enjoyed it. It was great storytelling. I really liked the characters. I liked how it was a different reading experience for me. I kept myself apart from the characters. I wasn't as invested in some ways because I knew bad things were going to happen, which I thought was very interesting. But in the end, I still ended up caring for them because I was very sad and bummed out when bad things happened. But it was definitely a different experience. I think Joe Abercrombie is a very skilled writer. I was very impressed. And so I am super glad I read it. I thought it was great. Just like warning, yes, grimdark is depressing. It was a fun new thing. I'm probably not going to be reading a lot of it. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the First Law trilogy in the comment box below. Let me know if you love grimdark as a genre, what your favorites are, and if you think there's any other ones that I might be able to handle, knowing what I did and didn't like about this book. Let me know if you tried grimdark for the first time and what you thought of it, if it is or isn't for you. I want to know all your thoughts in the comment box. And if you want to support me and you like this video and want to watch more, please subscribe. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.